extremely excited to introduce you guys to Dr. Ben Houltberg. And he is okay if you don't reference the doctor, but out of respect for his years of study and investment in his personal development, I'm going to refer to him as Dr. Ben Houltberg. So I was first introduced to Ben. You guys have heard me reference his work and his name. I always give credit to him, just for the record, but Ben's research and work really helped me give a name to what I experienced 10 years ago when I had my premature midlife crisis. When I was overextending myself, when I was basically, I think we kind of categorize it, we just lump it in the landscape of leadership. We just lump it into, oh, well, yeah, I'm a workaholic, and we kind of wear that as a badge of honor. I work too much. But I think what Ben's research has revealed is there's actually a name for it. There's a way to engage with it. There's a way to understand it, some of what's happening inside of us. So in the spirit of emotional intelligence, basically being able to name what's happening inside of us, to identify it, to take responsibility for it, and not live in denial of it. I've really been encouraged by, and it's given some structure to some of what we do at Next Level as we try to support you as a leader who carry a lot of responsibility. So without further ado, I want to introduce you guys to Dr. Ben Houltberg, who is calling in from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Ben, so glad to have you here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love this topic and get excited about it, and I'm excited to talk to you all today.
So Ben, kick us off by explaining to us how you got into this work and some of your background that led to the research that you've done.
Yeah, I was thinking about where to start, but I'll never forget. It still sticks in my brain and my body. Really is. I'll never forget. It was the U.S. Open, and this is the U.S. Open for track and field, not for golf. I wish it was golf. It would make a lot more money. And it was at Stanford in Palo Alto, California. I was in I think the third year of my professional career. I'd picked up a sponsorship, mostly on incentives. So when you're going to perform and you have incentives, you have a lot at stake. And if I perform well, I was right on the verge for the Olympic trials. And I went to Palo Alto. I was experiencing some trauma in my life and some challenges and difficulties, but I was really good at compartmentalizing. I thought I could put it over there, and I used it often as fuel to get me up in the morning, to push me, to help me, dig down deep often when I felt like I needed it. And I'll never forget, I was in the best shape of my life. The workouts were going so well. I was ready. There was at the time, the world leader in the 1500 meters was in my race. The stage was set. Everything was set for me. And I remember warming up, and just like I always do to get in the mindset, I had done this for so many years of my life, and the gun goes off, and I just bonked. I had nothing. I settled into the back of the pace. I had no fight, and I was devastated. The race was over. I went back to my hotel room, and I was all by myself. I felt I let everybody down in my life at that point. I let my family, my sponsor, everybody. And I remember curling up and just losing it. And I couldn't move. And it was really this moment of my life that stuck with me. And what I realize now, looking back, is I recognize what happened physiologically, what happened to me in my body in that moment that undermined my performance, that my worth and my value was so wrapped up in performance, that in that moment, in addition to the trauma and the things in my life, it had pulled the resources even before I ever stepped on the line. And that was a watershed moment for me. And I wish I could say there was a happy ending to my athletic career. I had qualified for the trials, I'd been injured, and when I retired, I really was going through a really difficult time, a transition of my life. I was in a PhD program at that time. I went through a divorce. I was really shattered, and I didn't want to have anything to do with athletics at that point. I was done. I was studying, looking at the psychophysiology of emotions and emotion regulation, how it impacts young people, particularly growing up in neighborhoods that were similar to mine growing up, where they're physiologically kind of were in this fear state often, and how relationships were really incredible protective processes. And so I just dove into that, and that's really where I began to understand things in a deeper way. And I was always an imposter in academia too, because I didn't know what academics, higher ed really was. I had nobody who really talked to me about college. My way through college was a scholarship for running. And so there was a lot of my own narrative in that I transferred from. I transferred one kind of performance domain to the next. And so I was dealing with that as I was going through it, and still not connecting the dots of my story at all. And people kept coming to me that were still, running and training. And I have a therapy background and a license in therapy. And so I kept saying, no, like, I'm not doing that anymore. But, some of the Olympians that were making the team that I ran against and others, and it just kept coming back around. And the discovery I made scientifically was really the connection between the kids who walk out their front door and there's a threat to their immediate self, that if we were to walk out our door and there was some sort of threat to yourself, whether it was a big mean dog or a lion or whatever, there's that physiological response that we have in the moment. It's the sympathetic nervous system, and it's activated in this real way to deal with that immediate situation, that immediate threat. It's not meant to deal with prolonged stress over time, and it's actually not our bodies do not handle that very well. At some point, there's this allostatic load that impacts that. And so my discovery was that same response, as if there's a lion sitting out your front door, happens when there's a threat to our social self. That when we put our worth and value in performance, that that the evaluation or the anticipation of an evaluation of who we are as a human being that's based in performance triggers the same physiological mechanism of threat and fear as the kids who are walking out their front door. And so that discovery started to really open this door. And that's when I started to study the idea of performance-based identity. What are the alternatives to that? What is the fuel that drives? And we started to study Olympians and high performers. And that took me to my time at USC and the Performance Science Institute, where we started to really look at this in cultures as well, and work cultures and leaders and individuals and athletic programs and climates. And so my journey really was a hesitation into coming back to performance. But that was kind of my story of getting into this work, was that it was a personal experience that then really, I'll just say, just kind of to finish that narrative, is that I had this opportunity that was pretty amazing, actually. So I was in my career. I went back to Stanford for something different. It had nothing to do with athletics. And our hotel was right off campus, not far from the track. And I could feel it physiologically when I went. This is how real the body records these kind of events. And I got up early that morning. I jogged over to the track, and I ran 1,500 meters around that track. At this time, I had my first son. I was married, remarried to an incredible woman, human being, who her unconditional love gave me the courage to chase a lot of my pain. And It was an incredible emotional experience, like emotionally corrective experience. As I ran around the track, I ran 1,500 meters. I wish I could say, oh, I broke my world record. I was jogging 1,500 meters. But I was thinking about my values of what's important to me as I was doing it. And I was thinking of my journey of getting to that moment and how the pain had been transformed into purpose. And that was a powerful moment for me to begin to think about, what does purpose really mean? Purpose is said a lot, but that rarely do people understand the science of what purpose really is and what the research says. And that corrective emotional experience really became kind of the cycle for me of redemption and coming back to a place where I really felt like it was my purpose to help other people pursue excellence and achievement without it coming at the cost of their relational emotional health.
Mm. That's so good. So the skeptic in me, or the cynic in me, that I think is that if I'd have heard this, and actually the first time I heard a story like yours from our mutual friend Jeff Schulte, and he talked about some of his journey and story of how he got in the work that he's involved in and helping people in a similar fashion that we're all engaged in doing. And I remember thinking, man, but I didn't have that kind of pressure. Like I wasn't an elite athlete. I wasn't performing at the US Open. I didn't have these kind of sponsors. I don't, so I think I had the tendency of, and in actuality, looking back, when I look back honestly at my life, there was a lot more, there was a lot more trauma, pressure, stress than I had told the truth about, or even knew what to call it. But for somebody that's saying, yeah, okay, that makes sense, Ben, for you to carry that kind of stress in the work that you were doing then, what would you say? How do you, because how do you make the reality of the sympathetic nervous system and that sense of fight or flight, or that sense of threat, real present day, under the weight of kind of performing in a leadership space?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, really, to me at this point in my career, I would say it's not whether or not you have a performance-based identity or you don't. It's really knowing that where you are on that continuum. And there's times in our lives where we can be triggered by a conversation, or by, if we feel threat from somebody else's success. But no high achiever that gets to a place of leadership in an organization I should say it this way: every leader that gets to the point where you are in an organization and you're leading an organization, it would be really rare not to deal with performance-based identity. It's so wrapped in our culture. It's so wrapped in everything around us. This idea that, really our narrative of who we are begins to be formed, from early days of our lives, and it continues. And we do a lot to maintain that in our lives. And we guard it at all costs. That when we feel like how people are perceiving us is different than how we want to be seen, that's when you'll feel that physiological response. When people challenge us, or they challenge a decision you made, or or let's make it more real, or your partner does, or your spouse or your child.
Whoa, getting too personal.
Yeah, all of those things. I think that's where we have to start to really become aware of, like, where is this coming from, and making sure that we have an understanding of ourselves that's deep enough to recognize when that is a perceived threat, or an value, like a perceived threat, versus something that we really can work on. And so, to me, honestly, the I'll just call it this: the Shad, the beauty of brokenness, or the failed, the divorce I went through, the trauma I had in my life, those things. They were awful, and they in a lot of ways impacted me to the core. But there's a beauty in brokenness when you have to kind of say, okay, where are my values? What is most meaningful to you? When you lose it all, or when you go through that experience, and those had nothing to do with track and field. Those had nothing to do. My drive for success, like I said, was completely transferred to my my doctoral program and then to my career. And it's something that I have to always be aware of, and gone through years of therapy and continue to to grow as a leader now, as running an organization, a nonprofit, and I see it every day. I see it in the people that come in, and the thing when we look at performance-based identity that I think is important. So what I found in my research is a couple of profiles, but one of them is interesting. You have the people who are like, the typical worker or athlete who's going to show up every day and be there early, and they're going to work late, and they're going to be putting in more hours, and they're going to be driven to success. And when that motivation is based on fear, a fear of failure, a fear of not being enough, a fear of which is often happens, that's not sustainable fuel. That's not gonna get them. But there's also the other profile of a performance-based identity that is in some ways a self-sabotage person, that they would rather not try than to try and fail. And so their narrative identity is so wrapped up in performance, but you might think that they just don't care, they don't have motivation, or they don't. And both of them come from the same source often, but we can kind of use the high achiever as the example person that coaches that I talk to might even say, well, I wish I could bottle up what they have and give it to everybody on the team, and we reinforce it in our society often. And we were doing some interviews with some CEOs as well. A friend of mine. John Ashley Knoll too, and he said, one of the CEOs said to him, I'm looking for, this is at this time, so Fortune 500 company, says, I'm looking for an employee who's a little bit insecure, because I know they're going to be the first one in the office and the last one to leave. Now, obviously that is not the right motivation, but the honesty there is there is a motivation there. And I think that's where it becomes important, Chad. It's like, how does this show up in our lives in different ways? And where are we on this continuum often? Is fear preventing us from moving out of our comfort zone because we would rather not try and fail than try? Is it driving us every day to work longer hours, to be on our phones checking emails when our kids are playing with us or talking to us? Is it those are all personal things that that leaders have to deal with and individuals have to deal with. And then how are we setting the context for our people? Let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with pursuing excellence and high performance. That's not the issue. It's the fuel behind it that becomes the issue.
That's huge distinction. Can you talk a little bit about, one, I want to hear personally, kind of going back into your narrative, I'd love to hear how you healed, like some of the things that you did and noticed and engaged in to recover from one of the most painful experiences, and how that still applies today. And then if you can also go into some detail about the research, and guys, for y'all on the call, I've got a copy of the research document, peer reviewed also, I believe, which is a phrase that I became more aware of during COVID and looking at all the research out there. But so another thing I wanted to too, if you guys have questions or thoughts while we're having this conversation, please post them in the chat, and we're going to get some stuff. There's stuff you want to hear more about or clarification on, post them in the chat. We'll spend time on the end. Luke Herman is a new member of our team I've just introduced. So say hi, Luke, so I can see there. Luke, hey man. So Luke is fresh to Memphis from Springfield, Missouri, and is helping us manage the Next Level program. So I'm excited for y'all to get to know him, but he'll be monitoring the chat for us, and we'll field some of those questions. But yeah, Ben, tell us about that process for you of restoration, healing, what you noticed about it, and then some of the more of the finer points of the research.
Yeah, I had done of course I'd done, coming up as an athlete, I've done some, imagery work and visualization work, and had done some things like that. mindset work, right? Like you learn to have this kind of, in a way, like a killer mindset of like, okay, I gotta try, I gotta push myself, I gotta train. But I was never aware of like just my internal dialogue. I was just never aware of how it was shaping my identity. I would look in the I would talk to myself in ways that I would now, as a parent, that I would just never talk to anybody else.
Right.
And I think for me that became really important. I discovered the power of mindfulness around that time, that was really around just mindfulness based stress reduction. And I started to utilize it in a more contemplative way that was consistent with even some of my own faith and spirituality growing up, and connecting to something bigger than myself and my own faith. And what mindfulness did was it gave me a tool to begin to separate and to become aware of my thoughts in ways that I could set a practice up every morning. And so I just started building. This has been, 12 years ago, I think, or maybe even 14 years ago. I don't know, but and that's become my practice of mindfulness. That's really involves also my own faith and my own spirituality. When I has created space for me to begin, that really allowed me to heal. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for me just to work my way out of this. That wasn't going to happen. But it began to give me some space to be able to be open to therapy more. I have to say too, I really needed unconditional love to give me courage and relationships that were healthy. And those healthy relationships also gave me the courage to say, oh yeah, I need to do work here, because I want to be better. I want to be a better brother, a better son, a better partner, a better, and eventually father. And so, it really was a process of multiple things that began to come together. And honestly, I wouldn't change it. I really wouldn't. I think right now where I am in my career, it has given me perspective, and not that it's not hard. I have to continually work on that. But it has given me a different perspective where I can feel confident and comfortable with what I have to offer, and have the understanding of like, what are my strengths? What do I bring to the table? And be confident in that, but also recognizing where I need support, where I need those people around me. And to be able to acknowledge those, and openly acknowledge those. And the power of that is for our staff, for even when I was teaching for my students, that's what stuck with people, is when I was able to recognize a mistake or something that came up and just name it in a way, is like, those came up on our staff surveys, those came up on my student surveys, and people saying, I really appreciated when you did this, like, and I think it unlocked some of that for me to be able to really be intentional about living my values every day, and surrounding myself with people that really have a shared purpose, and are I'm able to be truly vulnerable with. And that was one of the most shocking things for me when I moved from academia, when I was, I got tenure and I went through the whole process, and I was running a center at USC, and then I moved into becoming now the CEO of a nonprofit. And the shocking thing to me was the isolation and loneliness of what happens when you get to that point where people in my organization stop, you feel like, oh, well, who do I talk to? What do I, like, how do I, go? So that's when I started to build a community, even in the space of leaders as well. So I think all of those things have been part of my journey.
Yeah, so good. We even as you talk about healthy, what I hear is healthy shame. It's the sense of, so much of our self-critique is self-deprecating, and it's often self-abusive, right? Instead of embracing just our limited humanity and not seeing that as something that's wrong with us, but saying, of course I've got limits. Of course I need help. And I love that you said strengths, and then you said areas that you need support in. And part of what we're wanting to create is a community of like-minded leaders that care about results. Like we're not saying quit pursuing big, lofty, ambitious goals.
Yep.
We're also saying you've got to also value relationship, because part of what your research reveals is relationship with people outside of our craft that love us regardless of how we perform or produce is part of what gives us the courage to stay in the infinite game as long as possible. So yeah,
Yeah.
so well said. Yeah, I'd love
Well,
for you to say
and let
more
me,
about that if you want to.
well, Shad, let me add that too. Like, I think the personal story and then the science I mean, it is really almost impossible to overstate the important impact of relationships. This is not just a nice thing to have. It is essential for high performance, period. When we look at the, research studies around relationships, some of which we've done too, and I've done, we deal with pain better. We deal with adversity better. Our brain registers pain in a different way when we're with somebody who we feel connected to, that knows us, that understands us.
Wow.
We look at challenge differently. We find meaning in life, even through adversity and challenge. Our immune system has improved. There's been studies where they track immune systems, those and look at relationship quality and the impact of that. Like, we're talking about not just a psychological concept, or, I mean, we're talking about it really all the way down to the molecular level of our genetic code of like what we express can be impacted by our environment and our relationships that we live in. And that is the power of relationship. It's not an add-on strategy. It has to be embedded in what we do. And now in this nonprofit that I lead, we really focus a lot on developmental relationships for young people, and thinking about what are those things that get all young people not only at what they are entitled to and what they deserve, it's being seen and valued and safe. And the power of what happens to us physiologically. I mean, if you think about emotion regulation, our ability to regulate our own emotions, what we could see physiologically when we had people hooked up to heart rate monitors and respiration, and we got cheek swabs and we did all this stuff. What you could see is that we regulate our emotion in the presence of people that help us downregulate. It's not just an internal process. It's also a relational process. And so I think that has been really like something I've had to kind of keep doubling down on. And as I had to create my own kind of life philosophy or mission, I think that has become helpful for kind of guiding me, is that I had to realize that. And so I first had this very long one, and I would go, and really now it's down to just live connected. And what I need to, like, I have to remind myself to live connected. When I don't, and when I isolate, when I begin to disconnect, that's when I feel the stress, that I can feel, I make bad decisions, I'm reactive, but I have to live connected to the people I care about, to my purpose. And really be able to continually recalibrate that on a daily basis, because otherwise I know that I can get off. My pain can take me to places, or my like, that's the reality of life, and so that has also been important.
So, and relationally speaking, because the invaluable essential nature of the fact that when we are made relationally, a lot of us would say, and before I kind of had my transformative impetus for change through loss and pain, similar as you described it, I was very connected. Like, I had a lot of friends.
Mm-hmm.
I was very social, but there is a difference of the quality or the nature of the relationships you're describing of
Yep.
connection. Can you dig into that a little bit more of what the
Yeah.
quality of those relationships look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the key is like you can't when you think about relationships, you rarely well when we work with leaders and that we do a lot of organizational work now, mostly nonprofit space, and people will always tell you relationships matter. And in fact, most of the time, what people will say is, "Oh yeah, relationships, we got that. We got." Then we collect the data, and we collect the data on certain aspects of relationships, how people are feeling that care is expressed in their organization, or how they express care, how they provide support, how do they actually walk alongside people, how do they challenge growth. How do they share power, and how do they expand possibilities? And so thinking about the elements of developmental relationship that apply really not just to young people, but to human beings, is that we function when we think about what do we naturally do. Some people are really good at challenging growth, and they're just not. It just hasn't been a way that they've a muscle they've exercised to learn how to express care. And the thing about these elements is it's not just about if you think you're doing them. I hate to tell people this, and it's true, right? Like you can think you're really good at relationships, but if the people around you don't think you're good at it, guess what? You're not good at relationships. And so being able to kind of get that feedback to say like, is what I'm are people picking up what I'm putting down? Like I think that's been an important piece too, is there's a discrepancy often. And so when I talk about relationships, we're not talking about just warm and fuzzies. We're not talking about just having happy hour or coffee, or we're talking about how are these things being built. And it also is, I mean, there's boundaries around relationships too. Like you have to have boundaries. You can't, your relationship with your best friend or your partner or people that you turn to is going to be different than your relationship with staff. And you have to have kind of the context of that relationship. But it doesn't mean that all five of those elements, express care, share power, provide support, expand possibilities, and challenge growth, are not important in relationships as well. They just might have the boundaries around what that looks like when you think about expressing, like for example, expressing care.
Mm-hmm. And part of our interest in the relational realm for the people on this call who we may not be elite athletes. I mean, Chris Hogue was a D1 punter, still has a record at UT as far as I know. But like, we're not all elite athletes, but we are carrying the pressure and we need support. And so if I'm interpreting your research properly, which you can correct me if I'm not, and I want you to dive into that so we have time of how it was done and what you learned. I know we've touched on some of that, but part of it was the quality of relationships outside of the sport.
Yep.
That mattered to the ability to stay present and perform.
Yep.
And so, from in my own experience, it was like, and I love those five: care, how is care expressed, support, walking alongside of, sharing power, and expanding possibilities. But for me, when I started to be more honest, and what we use the word vulnerable, and you express that with people that didn't need anything from me, that could love me unconditionally, the powerful shift of my ability to actually receive that unconditional love. Because if I'm performing for it, then it doesn't feel unconditional, and it feels like it's my responsibility to keep it, which goes back to depleting those resources that you talked about. It's more pressure.
Yeah.
So if I'm interpreting that properly, but go, Chris said, punter and elite athlete might be an oxymoron. That's not true, Chris.
I agree. I definitely think that's elite level too. Having those guys running at you to kill you, I think,
that's right.
The punt off. Yeah. Absolutely. I think what one thing emerged, and we did a lot of, so the study, the one that Shad has, is one aspect of that whole data set. We did deep kind of qualitative interviews with athletes. We spent a lot of time, and this is really, that was the first data set that studied purpose in a elite athlete sample. And so we had Olympic athletes, gold medalists, professional athletes, football players, baseball. We had a wide mix of athletes. And one of the narratives that came up is contingent relationships, like where there's this feeling of like, you only care about me for what I can do for my performance, for what I can do for you, what I can, and that really does perpetuate what you're saying, Shad. Like we all know who cares about us, and we often can surround ourselves with people in our lives and that can give us life, or that can also kind of suck the life out of us. Like you know, and I think there's certain times we have to figure out who do we want in that circle for us, and how do we be really particular about that. I don't know about you all, maybe you feel different, but like I'm almost 45. Making friends now is just hard and weird. Like we moved from LA 2 years ago, and we were in LA, and I was born in LA, and you know, it's a really an interesting thing to like have people you grow up with, people in their life that you know for a long time, and then beginning to build connections with people that you know at this point in your life and this time are really critical. And I think that that's part of it, is like being able to be vulnerable enough to make those connections now for what you need in your life, and how you can, it's reciprocal, right? It's give and take. If it's not give and take, then that, I mean, that can happen too with your kids, for example. Your kids actually, you know, if you think from a developmental standpoint, a kid doesn't choose to be born into this world, and they don't owe you anything when they're born into this world. Like that is from a developmental standpoint, I often say that it's like our job is to provide the love that helps them see that they're valued, to keep them safe. Those are things are owed to them in a way, and so
do teenagers owe us anything?
I know. What I think is the theory behind that is that, you know, when they become parents, they have to pass that love on, you know. But yeah, I know it's a hard one. Teenagers are a hard one. So what the point there is to say, in a relationship that's horizontal, in a relationship where you really, that it has to be give and take, and it has to be a partnership in that way, where if you're being vulnerable with somebody, you know, they can be vulnerable back. Now in professional relationships like therapy, it's a little bit different, but in connections, strong connections, that's an important piece to look at. Are you giving more than you're receiving? Are you always the one who they're it's easy for me to fall into the category of giving a lot in relationships because it's more comfortable for me. And so I had to start this around people around me that also I would allow to support me as well.
Mm-hmm. So talk, if you can, I know you can, talk more about those two identities that came from that study in terms of the purpose, some of the distinctives of a purpose-based and performance-based self-narrative profiles.
So the purpose-based identity is interesting. Like if you looked at performance and you just look at the raw performance, at first, when we first were looking at it, I was like, oh, well, you know, those with performance-based identity, they, when you look at some of the metrics at first, is like, oh, they perform better. But as we dug into the data more, it became really interesting to see that actually in the purpose-based identity space, what you saw was a higher level actually of people who got gold medals or medals at the World Championships or the Olympics, those who had national championships. The performance-based were more likely to get there, to be in the Olympic trials, to get to some of the events. The purpose-based people were more likely to bring something home. And this was like the year of the Olympics, actually. It was just previous to the Olympics. And and that was kind of a like, okay, let's look at this. Like, okay, so we have high performers, but all of them for their own right are high performers. But what is it that's distinguishing them? And so this is where it became very clear that those in the performance-based identity space, they had higher levels of depression, of anxiety, of shame after a failed experience, a threat to themselves, like feeling a threat to themselves. Where the purpose-based identity people, they had this sense of value that was beyond, outside of sports, that was connected to something more. They had this idea of themselves that was not just, it was a more global sense of self-worth and value. And they also had the social support that they could turn to. And so what was really, I think, inspiring for me to think about is like how, when the fuel is purpose, it's more of a sustainable fuel over time, because you're being drawn to something often more than being pushed or driven. And so there has been some talk of, like, you know, in a lot of work in this purpose, more in the in writing, purpose driven, being purpose driven. And I was always hesitant to use that language, because I also think what we can be careful. We have to be careful that we're not just kind of transferring our purpose drivenness to something else. Like, it has to be something that really begins to be integrated to who we are and our identity. Because, you know, I've seen people that do amazing work, but they burn themselves out all in the name of purpose. Like, you know, whether that's nonprofits, whether that's, you know, church, well, whatever it is. And I think so we have to be really clear about like what the difference is there. And I think that was another important piece as we started to distinguish and look at these different profiles. Purpose is something a little bit different. It's like really the ability. I mean, well, I'll just talk about the science of purpose. Purpose is not just, you know, having a goal. Really, the three levels of purpose is one, you know, you have to care about it. It has to have personal meaning to you, so it has to be aligned with your values. Two, they have to be connected to action. So you have to be moving towards it, and for it to be purpose. And three, it has to be connected to something bigger than yourself. That's a contribution to those around you. That there's an altruistic nature to what you're doing. And that really is a key distinguisher, I think, that people don't talk about. And so that's what I started to really move into as we started to discover this, is the power of kind of service, of purpose. So what does that do for us in the sense of our identity? How does it bring us stability in our ability to put it all out there, or to pursue something without it threatening, being a threat to ourselves? And that is where we started to really get into some really cool work of thinking about how people build their identity around something more solid.
Yeah, you referenced values. I love the three aspects of purpose, of caring about it, which you said is aligned with our values. And one of the things, I mean, there's so much good stuff in here, but one of the things we try to develop is a values framework, because the values help us establish the boundaries, you know, letting the good things in and keeping bad things out. And again, purpose, values, mission, identity, some of these words that maybe feel a little hollow for a lot of us, that may get overused, but each of those words has so much depth and power and potential. How would you describe values as you see it in this context, in the work and these identities, and how do people go about establishing those?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things we've done as well is, like, when there's a couple clients that I've worked with at high performing organizations, where we do this kind of values assessment, where people identify what are their top 5 values, or what are the top 5 values for whatever domain. And then we start to, what is interesting is you look at like leaders' values and what they value, and then you look at what their staff values as well. And you start to think about like value connection, because shared values becomes really critical in organizations, right? Like we all have our own personal values. When they become shared values, it's something about my value is connected to this organization's, whatever it is, like mission. Then there starts to be kind of the shared values. But what's interesting about values that is the critical step is we can all say like, typical values of like, respect or humility or integrity or, gratitude or all kind of the list. There's no shortage of names of values that are out there. But we really have to start to say, okay, it's even what does that, how do you define that value? So respect, let me give you an example of respect. So respect was one value that came up. And in one context, as we started to talk about respect, some people would talk about what respect means, respecting each other, regardless of differences, points of views. And one person spoke up and said, for me, respect is about fear. And whoa, okay, well, let's talk about that. Is that what you want your staff to think about when you talk about respect? And so one of the things that I say is first, it's the value and thinking about the value. It's defining what it is to you. And then I think it's also critical to establish the do's and the don'ts. So what are the do's and don'ts behaviors of that particular value? This is what it actually looks like in behavior. Because if we don't start to get into the behavior realm, we can't recognize it in our own life. We can't take stock of it. We might just see ourselves as having high integrity. And because we all want to see ourselves as having high integrity. We all want to see ourselves as having, being high in humility. We all want to see ourselves. So we have to begin to move the value into a behavior place that we can begin to take stock of ourselves, and really be able to live that out and get feedback on those things. And I think that's where values into action become really critical for us. That values can be hollow, just like purpose can. But they also can be transformational when you begin to really make them the guiding principle for your life. And that's hard to do. I mean, that's a hard thing to do. Is if we say we value relationships, getting through your day and taking stock and percentage of how much you invested in relationships that day versus how many emails you sent or how many, finance reports you went over or how many, whatever it is. Like that's where it starts to meet the road for us.
Yeah, and if you've been in next level or you're in it currently, we will do this if you haven't already, is we have the values exercise. And I think what we've got to take a little bit further is taking stock to your point, Ben, of if it's an actual value, but something else continues to trump it, and to overshadow it, and we choose that over the said value, then we've got to, again, not in a shaming way, not in a, we just got to pay attention to it. It's like, what do I keep choosing in contrast to what it is I say I'm valuing, and what do I want to do about it? And that's kind of the realm of commitment. And so I really ask everybody on this call, as we don't want this to just be an entertaining conversation. We want this to be something you're able to take, and there's so much meat out there that Ben's offered. If you guys think about things that you're taking away that you'd want to commit to, feel free to share those in the chat, or we'll give you a little bit of time at the end. But Ben, I guess the last question as we kind of wrap up our time, how would you advise us or help us to recognize where we are on the continuum of, am I in my performance state or am I in my purpose state? Like, how would I recognize that, and what might be ways to continue to move toward and into purpose?
Yeah, for me, it's been, I think part of it is really spending time with self-awareness of like, for me, I had to create some ways that I recognize when I'm really moving into performance-based identity. It might be like, you might find yourself overreacting to small things. It's that time where you're like, you wish you would have waited. Again, maybe you all are much more evolved than I am, but you wish you would have waited to send that email till the next day, right? Like you got that email and it's in front of you and you feel this reaction. You're like, oh yeah, well, let me just, and you send it off. And then the next day you're like, well, why did I make a big deal out of that? Well, I know when that happens that something's happening in that I need to attend to be able to, and I'm moving into this space. Maybe I feel like someone has threatened, my authority or like threatened, something like that. Where I'm like,
My
oh, wait a
confidence,
second,
yeah.
like, this is me, and so I feel like we have to begin to put those warning signs in place for us. Here are a couple warning signs that we developed, and I can send you. They're I think they're out there too, and there's several podcasts and there's several ways, but I'll send them to you. But some of them are really about like, evaluation. So when you're getting ready for when you're being evaluated, if you're really feeling kind of this fear of what that evaluation is going to bring, or you're feeling threatened, anytime there's even somebody's asking questions that begin to question a way that approach or something that you're doing, if your first instinct is to really be reactive to that and feel fear of like, well, people are not going to see me as competent, that's a pretty good sign that there's something about that evaluation that's triggering your performance-based identity. If really thinking about challenge, like if you feel like it's easier to stay in your comfort zone and it's hard for you to step out of that. You have to ask yourself, well, why? Why is it the case that I want to stay in this comfort zone and not grow? Whether that's being vulnerable, whether that's expressing your emotion more, whether that's speaking up if some people are more introverted, whatever it is. I think recognizing what is it that's preventing me from moving out of this. I think that we have 12 of these that were written for sports, but they can be applied. I'm trying to think of the other ones. It's been a while. I'll send those kind of, but really,
yeah, please do.
Develop your own warning signs for when you're moving into that. And another one for me might be like at home. Like, I'll know if I come home and there's like, well, I'll give an example early on in my marriage where it was like I think it was something, and there are several situations. One was like something as simple as the dishes, like that they were the comment of like, oh yeah, well, could you at least get these dishes done? I may have a long day at work, and we try to trade off on who cooks and then who does dishes, and we try to do all that. And I might say, oh, like I got so much going on, and what are you saying? I'm a bad parent or a bad, so something small becomes like big in that moment in my personal life.
You feel like you're being attacked.
Exactly. And that's it. Like if you're perceiving attacks, even in neutral statements, that's a pretty good sign that you need to do some self-care there. And so, I think that's been a big part of it for me, is like starting to recognize what those warning signs are for me. And then honestly doing the equal of just doing practices around my purpose to really keep centering myself in that. On Monday, I always take stock of thinking about my week for my to-do list, but I also spend time thinking about those value behaviors of saying, what do I want to make sure I do? And often what'll come to mind is like, I need to make sure I touch base with so-and-so, that person on my staff. I need to make sure I'm like things that I want to make sure that I'm doing as a leader and communicating as a leader. I try to spend some time to do that as well at the start of my week, and then kind of just taking stock of it as the week goes on and reflecting. There's great exercises that you can there's, and I could send some resources here too, but Ashley oh gosh, her last name, excuse me. She wrote a book about time wealth, like creating a wealth of our time, how often we trade off time for shortcuts or for things that actually is worth more than if we pay extra or we do this thing. And so one of them is around taking stock of in thinking about our purpose and doing that when we first wake up in the morning, not reaching for, creating those habits in our lives that our habits are formed not by my moral strength or mindset, they're formed by really setting cues in your environment too. Like its habits get formed in this way. So how do we create those habits and those reminders in our environment that thinking about things like when I go to get my cup of coffee every day, which I do first thing in the morning, to connect something to it, whether it's like a gratitude moment to say, what am I thankful for today as I get my coffee, which I know I'm going to do every day. And you start to connect those habits in your life to build purpose. So it's not just about the warning signs, it's also about enhancing those moments. And as you expand those things and those habits and the ways that you'll start to find that other side shrinking more too. And so it's both, it's both of those. So.
Yeah, I want to see that book. That's been a topic of conversation for us recently as a community, is the sense of feeling victimized by time, and kind of what I was imagining as I was trying to read the minds of the people on this call, of thinking, man, now you're giving me another list of stuff that I've got to do that I already don't have time for. And I think that's such a that's a shift that we're going to have to work really hard to make, to recognize that we've got all the time we need, we've got all the time we're supposed to have, and that doing more and doing it faster is not the way forward to fuller health emotionally and relationally, because that's more the treadmill that we're trying to get off of. We say that the stress we feel today is technologically driven, but relationally solved. And that part of that relationship is a relationship with ourselves, connecting to that sense of identity and purpose. So, man, Ben, this is so good. I could do this for a while longer. You guys, okay, Ashley Willen is the author from Harvard, and the book is Time Wealth. So we'll link to that, and I'll pick up a copy or listen to that on the road. What questions, comments, or commitments come up for anybody here with the couple minutes we got left? Any major takeaways? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll say, I think what you said that really resonated with me is like tying the little moments to like a moment of gratitude or something of that nature. Because oftentimes it's easy to get caught up in just what you're doing, right? It's the next task, it's the next thing. Just check the list, check the list, check the list. And eventually the things that you say are important, you've not spent time actually addressing, meditating on, or finding reflection about. So I mean, from a commitment standpoint, I can sit here and say that, the cup of coffee, the time at the gym, what is it that I'm going to, not just sit there mindlessly thinking about, but intentionally live and say, hey, when I'm getting my cup of coffee in the morning, like that's 2 minutes for me to, thank God for the day, or to think about my family and what I need to do for them today, or be appreciative, or, whatever the situation is. I think I can walk away from this and say, you know what, this is something that is going to help me live more intentionally as I continue the leadership journey.
That's awesome. Yeah. The small things
That's
can
great,
make
Michael.
huge differences like that too. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, over time, for certain. I mean, that has definitely been my experience. One more. 10 o'clock on the dot. Anybody have another one? Ben, thanks, man. I'd love for us to be able to do this again, if you're willing.
Sure.
Put you on the spot in front of everybody.
No, I enjoy it, and please feel free to reach out to me. You'll see some things that are out there, and this is part of. I enjoy doing it because this is part of my purpose, and I hope that there's so much wisdom in this room. There's so many things that you bring too. So I would love to learn from you all as well as you interact with these kind of materials. And so thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody. You have a great day.